SLT Mobitel Fiber, the fiber of the nation. SLT Mobitel Fiber, the fiber of the nation.
රින් සුපිරි එලියා වෙළඳපොලේ අඩුම මිලකට රුපියල් 160යි.
Tonight, Western demands. The European Union wants progress on PTA revision before early next year and also calls for the abolition of the death penalty in the island. UN rumblings. Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York speaks against obtrusion.
We must realize that we cannot superimpose the cultures and traditions of one country on another.
Balancing act. India's foreign secretary arrives in the island. Reconciliation and devolution of power also said to be on the agenda. A pill to go with the jab. A US company develops a COVID pill.
The efficacy of this particular antiviral is obviously very good news.
We have to be careful about saying that this is going to be a miracle.
All that and much more coming up on First at 9, this Saturday, the 2nd of October, 2021.
දසනකාන්තී චූර්ණය සහිත ලීවර් ආයුෂ් දන්තාලේපය දත්වල ඇති ප්‍රශ්න 10ක් වළකයි.
From AdaDerana, this is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening, welcome to First at 9, I'm Dhamke Kanai. Now then, the European Union wants Sri Lanka to abolish the death penalty in its entirety and also to make progress on the revision of the Prevention of Terrorism Act before the EU-Sri Lanka Joint Commission meeting planned for early next year. These views have been communicated during the meeting of the EU-Sri Lanka Working Group on Good Governance, Rule of Law and Human Rights on Wednesday. A wide range of matters had been on the agenda, with the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, independence of the judiciary, devolution of power, as well as the ongoing work of Sri Lanka's independent institutions also discussed.
The European Union Sri Lanka Working Group on Good Governance, Rule of Law and Human Rights had met last Wednesday for the regular bilateral exchanges between the two factions. During the 5th Working Group meeting, the Foreign Ministry said that the two partners affirmed their commitment to good governance, adherence to rule of law and protection of human rights. They had also discussed common interests pertaining to the protection and promotion of fundamental rights as well as freedoms and agreed to continue cooperation on issues of relevance. During the meeting, the EU had highlighted the importance of fostering social, economic and political inclusion through justice, reconciliation and accountability. Both the sides had discussed a range of matters including the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, independence of the judiciary, devolution of powers as well as the ongoing work of Sri Lanka's independent institutions, and both the parties had stressed on the importance of effective functioning of independent institutions. Sri Lanka had also updated the European Union on the extensive legal reforms undertaken by the Ministry of Justice via consultative processes, bringing together officials and sector experts. The EU had meanwhile encouraged the country to consider a broader consultation process in this regard. During the working group meeting, both EU and Sri Lanka had agreed on the importance of engaging civil society and giving it the necessary space to function in all its diversity, and the EU extended their continuous support to Sri Lanka in such efforts. Among other topics of discussion had been matters related to minorities and to address hate speech. Sri Lanka had made note of the pluralistic composition of the country, where the rights of all communities are equally guaranteed by the Constitution. Further, the EU had been briefed on the review process of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and Sri Lanka had reiterated its commitment to bring the Act in line with the international norms and standards with a time-bound process. The two parties also agreed to review the progress in this regard by the next meeting of the EU-Sri Lanka Joint Commission in early 2022, with the need to uphold international norms and standards of human rights, while countering terrorism and violent extremism also being underlined during the talks. The European Union, meanwhile, had expressed their opposition towards death penalty in all circumstances, and while welcoming the continued moratorium, the EU had encouraged the island to do away with the capital punishment. What's more, the working group had discussed cooperation with the Human Rights Council and agreed to work towards enhancing cooperation in multilateral fora, including in the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030.
Now then, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the United Nations in New York, Mohan Peiris, reaffirmed the country's commitment to fulfill its obligations towards its people as per the provisions of the Constitution. Addressing the second meeting of the Third Committee of the UN General Assembly at its 76th session yesterday, he also voiced against superimposing a country's own culture and traditions on another, while also repelling the one-size-fits-all practice in policy formation.
Progressive development of inclusive domestic policy and national governance must incorporate the needs and the vision of every sector of society, including women and children, older persons, people living with a disability, and indigenous people, to name a few. This kind of progressive and inclusive policy can be developed only if the principles of equality and respect for the freedoms and liberties of all are accommodated within that state policy. As all nations, big and small, strive to rise out of the havoc and the misery caused by the pandemic, it is essential that we grasp this opportunity and go back to basics. We must realize that we cannot superimpose the cultures and traditions of one country on another. Development programs must be tailored to meet the needs of the local population, bearing in mind their cultural and social sensitivities. As we endeavor to meet the social, humanitarian, and human rights of our citizens, we must appreciate that the common policy applicable globally is not practical and will not yield results. There is also a dire need to provide local mechanisms, the time, the space to carry out their mandates, so that they are able to effectively bring about the transformational changes that we all so desire. It is with these intentions and firm beliefs that Sri Lanka commits to its obligations of ensuring a secure and safer society for its people and for the global community at large.
On women and children, Sri Lanka's permanent representative to the UN in New York, Mohan Peiris, said that the island has taken a rights-based and a victim-centered approach to ensure their rights are protected in the backdrop of the pandemic, with a number of policies also implemented in this regard.
The country's constitution recognizes the principle of gender equality and non-discrimination. In addition, it is well understood that economic autonomy is a critical factor in the continued empowerment of women and girls. And as such, we continue to advocate for women-friendly policies and is committed to bridging the gender gap and providing greater opportunities for women in the economy and the workplace. Sri Lanka continues to advocate for the protection of the basic rights and dignities of its people, even in the midst of a pandemic, and to ensure the building back process accounts for greater protection.
Peiris also gave an account of the positive measures Sri Lanka took to mitigate COVID-induced disruptions to the country's education sector.
We greatly value quality education as a means of eradicating poverty and achieving progress. To ensure access to education was provided, free internet facilities were provided to undergraduate students. E-learning special students data packages were introduced at concessionary rates, and special education programs were broadcast on television and national radios to limit the disruption of education.
He also expressed commitment to fulfill Sri Lanka's obligations towards its citizens.
Sri Lanka has enjoyed universal adult franchise as perhaps of the few countries of this world that has completely eradicated terrorism from its soil and is taking bold steps to build back better. I wish to reiterate that the government's commitment and responsibilities towards its citizens, we therefore envisage an equitable economic development in a peaceful and prosperous Sri Lanka. Despite the challenges, we remain committed to fulfilling our obligations in accordance with the constitutional provisions of the country.
Now, turning our attention towards the pandemic situation, Minister of Health Keheli Rambukpelle expresses contentment with the island's current situation as the month-long curfew has produced the desired results by bringing down new COVID cases and deaths. However, just as it was before, the Ministry of Health urges people not to let their guard down and to continue adhering to health and safety guidelines, as failure to do so would reverse the hard-made gains.
Placing a country under a complete curfew is the last resort that any government would resort to. The economic loss in such an eventuality can undoubtedly be substantial, with a significant day revenue running into billions. A rise in COVID cases and deaths push the country towards exactly that. Though the economic loss remains to be addressed, the quarantine curfew the country was under until yesterday morning looks to have gone some way in bringing new COVID cases and deaths down. The daily caseload, which at one point stood at over 5,000, is now under 1,000.
මේ මොහොතේ තවම අපි දකින්නේ රෝගීන් අතිවිශාල සංඛ්‍යාවක් දිනකට රෝහල් ගත වුණු සමයක රෝහල් ගත වුණු රෝගීන් අතරින් සංකූලතා සහිත රෝගීන් තමා මේ සති දෙක තුනකට පස්සේ බොහෝ වෙලාවට මිය යන්නේ. මේ කාල පරාසය ඉදිරියටත් පවත්වාගෙන යවෙනවා. ඒ නිසා මේ අඩුවන රෝගීන්ට සාපේක්ෂව සැබෑ මරණ අඩුවීම දකින්න පුළුවන් වුණොත් වෙන්නේ තවත් සතියකට දෙකකට පස්සේ. හැබැයි අපි දන්නවා මේ වන විටත් පෙර තිබිච්ච සංඛ්‍යාවලට වඩා මරණ අඩු වෙලා තියෙනවා. ඉදිරියටත් අපිට මේ රෝගීන් සංඛ්‍යාව මේ ආකාරයෙන්ම අඩු කර ගැනීමට හැකියාව ලැබුණොත් මරණ සංඛ්‍යාවත් මීට සාපේක්ෂව අඩු වෙයි කියලා අපිට බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්න පුළුවන්.
Meanwhile, with many COVID deaths mainly reported among patients with comorbidities, the World Health Organization cites bad air quality as a factor that could contribute to the development of severe complications among high-risk groups with COVID.
It's clear that the bad quality of the air we breathe will be a major risk factor for acute and chronic respiratory diseases and cardiovascular diseases. In addition to that, if you are exposed to air pollution, you will develop certain diseases, underlying diseases that will give you a greatest possibility of develop severe cases of COVID if you are affected. So we see a clear relationship between air pollution and the burden of COVID-19 in places that were very polluted. This is an additional reason why now on the recovery post-COVID-19 we need to reimagine a greener world with clean sources of energy, a place where we can breathe air that is not killing us.
In any case, the solution is to ensure that COVID patients do not develop severe complications. As the world has seen and heard over the past months, the key to ensuring such is vaccination. 95% of Sri Lanka's population above the age of 30 is fully inoculated so far. Simultaneously, the vaccination of children over the age of 12 with comorbidities and people aged between 20 to 29 are also being carried out in the country. Though Sri Lanka's vaccine purchases have come to an end, the dues via the COVAX facility of the World Health Organization continues to flow in. A consignment of 400,000 doses of the Pfizer vaccine arrived in the island last night. Another batch of 408,650 doses of the same jab also arrived the day before yesterday via the COVAX facility.
Out of the entire requirement, we have got about nearly 20% as a gift from the COVAX facility, and we are ever thankful to WHO, the American assistance that we have got from all the countries across, and we are quite happy at the moment with the proceedings of the vaccination. In terms of the percentages, if you look at, we have passed the 50% mark, and we are now around 55% if you look at the entire population. But if you look at over 30s, we are almost 100% on both vaccines, and we are quite content at the moment. We are planning and we are sort of managing affairs to almost, I would say, satisfaction. I'm a little careful with this because things can change, because there are countries where they have done it, but then some new variant comes and then we have to meet the situation. So given consideration to that, as of now, I think we are doing quite all right.
There's been a very successful ongoing vaccination campaign, as the Minister has said, and the United States government is proud to have contributed through the COVAX mechanism. First Moderna vaccines and now Pfizer. Almost 800,000 doses have arrived in 2 flights, the second of which we see here. This is a very important contribution to containing the pandemic and managing it going forward. We look forward to continued collaboration.
Big 3.
Now, the Election Commission had sought empowerment in dealing with the violations pertaining to the media criteria prepared by it, and had elaborated on the need for a systematic program to regulate conventional and social media during election season. Its views had been expressed when the Select Committee of Parliament to identify appropriate reforms of the election laws and the electoral system and to recommend necessary amendments convened for a second day yesterday. The prospect of counting votes electronically had also been discussed.
Chairman of the Election Commission Naval has proposed that powers be granted to the Commission to deal with the violations pertaining to the media criteria prepared by it. Speaking at a Select Committee of Parliament to identify appropriate reforms of the election laws and the electoral system and to recommend necessary amendments on Thursday, he had added that it was essential that the media criteria be prepared for Parliament for approval. He also stressed that there should be a systematic program to regulate the media and social media during the election season. The Elections Commission had also stated that a comprehensive amendment should be made to the existing method of disposing the deposits of candidates under the current Local Government Election Act. Further, it had been suggested that a mobile voting system be set up for the disabled, and the new amendments should be made to allow the visually impaired to cast their ballots through a braille system. They also pointed out that a new program should be implemented to protect the suffrage of foreign workers as well. What's more, it said that a mechanism for the declaring assets and liabilities should be activated and steps should be taken to legalize election ethics. The Commission also called for an electronic method of counting votes. On this, however, the Select Committee pointed out that it is more practical to count the votes at the polling booth itself, while noting that reports of individuals being registered in the electoral rollout at 2 locations. Meanwhile, the Election Commission had emphasized that strikes and protests during the election period are a major obstacle to a free and fair election. The need to hold by-election to file a vacancy created by a Member of Parliament vacating their seat was also discussed during the proceedings of the Select Committee of Parliament to identify new appropriate reforms of the election law and the electoral system and to recommend necessary amendments.
3 Japanese naval ships arrived at the Colombo port today, and 2 of them will be taking part in a joint naval exercise with the Sri Lanka Navy. Meanwhile, the 8th edition of India-Sri Lanka mega military exercise Mitra Shakti will get underway on Monday with the objective of enhancing counter-terror cooperation.
A trio of Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force ships arrived at the port of Colombo on an official visit today. Only 2 among them, Kaga and Murasame, will partake in a joint naval exercise with the Sri Lanka Navy. Kaga is a 248-meter-long destroyer manned by a crew of 210, while Murasame is a 150-meter ship with 200 crew. The 2 vessels arrived in Colombo from Australia and are scheduled to sail back on Monday the 4th following joint naval exercise. The other destroyer, Fuyuzuki, a 151-meter-long platform with 220 crew, also arrived in Colombo today. However, its purpose is replenishment and will leave the island tomorrow. Meanwhile, India and Sri Lanka are set to carry out a 12-day mega military exercise starting from Monday with the objective of enhancing counter-terror cooperation. Confirming the 8th edition of the Mitra Shakti, the Indian Ministry of Defence said in a statement that the military exercise will be conducted at the Combat Training School in Ampara until the 15th of this month. An all-arms contingent of 120 personnel of the Indian Army will participate in the exercise, along with a battalion of the Sri Lankan Army, with the aim of enhancing interoperability while sharing best practices in counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism operations. The statement also read that the exercise will involve tactical-level operations at sub-unit level in an international counter-insurgency and counter-terrorism environment. The 7th edition of the Mitra Shakti exercise was conducted in 2019 at the Foreign Training Node in Pune, India.
Indian Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla arrived in the country at 7:41 this evening on a 4-day official visit at the invitation of his Sri Lankan counterpart, Admiral Professor Jayanath Columbage. As per Indian media, assessing progress on a number of infrastructure and energy projects and Sri Lanka's need for economic assistance will be at the top of the agenda. Announcing the visit in a statement, the Foreign Ministry says that his visit will contribute towards consolidating the long-standing multifaceted relations and enhance bilateral partnerships between the 2 countries. Apart from the bilateral discussion with his Sri Lankan counterpart, Shringla is expected to call on the President, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance and the Foreign Minister. Indian media reports Shringla is expected to raise concerns about the reconciliation process and promises of devolution of power in northern Sri Lanka. The Indian Foreign Secretary is also expected to visit Kandy, Trincomalee and Jaffna during his stay in the island. This will be his first visit to Sri Lanka since taking office as the Foreign Secretary of India. Welcome back. You're watching First at 9. Now, oil settled above $78 a barrel yesterday, just shy of a 3-year high reached earlier this week on expectations that OPEC ministers will maintain a steady pace in raising supply. The Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and Allies are set to meet on Monday. The group is slowly unwinding record output cuts made last year, although it is also reported that it is considering doing more to boost production. Brent crude rose 97 cents to settle at $79.28 in its fourth weekly rise. US West Texas Intermediate, meanwhile, rose 85 cents to settle at $75.88 in a sixth week of gains. Brent has risen over 50% this year and reached a three-year high of $80.75 on Tuesday. OPEC Plus is facing pressure from consumers such as the United States and India to produce more to help reduce prices, as demand has recovered faster than anticipated in some parts of the world. Oil is also finding support as a surge in natural gas prices globally prompts power producers to move away from gas. Generations in Pakistan, Bangladesh and Middle East have started switching fuels. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 482.54 points to 34,326.46, while the S&P 500 rose 49.50 points to 4,357.04 after the broad stocks index closed out its biggest monthly loss since March last year. The technology-focused Nasdaq Composite Index rose 118.12 points to 14,566.70. For the week, S&P 500 lost 2.2% and the Nasdaq fell 3.2%, their largest drop since the late February this year. The Dow, meanwhile, lost 1.4%, its largest drop since the week ended on the 10th of September. Market analysts say that equities turning for the better midday combined with other risk-on trades like a sharp rally in the cryptocurrency Bitcoin gave some investors the gumption to wade back into the market. Markets in Europe also retreated as the Stoxx Europe 600 dropped 0.4% to 452.90, led lower by shares of banks, oil and gas companies and basic resources producers. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei 225 lost 2.3% to 28,771.07 and South Korea's Kospi fell 1.6% to 3,019.18. US pharmaceutical company Merck has announced that its oral drug against COVID-19 reduced 50% of hospitalizations and deaths among high patients and those with severe disease. Even though US health experts look at the development positively with much optimism, Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine says that it cannot be called a miracle drug just yet.
Interim clinical results announced yesterday revealed that Merck's experimental oral drug for COVID-19, molnupiravir, reduced by around 50% the chance of hospitalization or death for patients at risk of severe disease. Merck and partner Ridgeback Biotherapeutics plan to seek US emergency use authorization for the pill as soon as possible and to submit applications to regulatory agencies worldwide. Due to the positive results, the phase 3 trial is being stopped early at the recommendation of outside monitors. If authorized, molnupiravir, which is designed to introduce errors into the genetic code of the virus, would be the first oral antiviral medication for COVID-19. Health officials in the US also welcome news of the pill but would not provide a timeline for when it could be approved by regulators.
The news of the efficacy of this particular antiviral is obviously very good news. The company, when they briefed us last night, had mentioned that they will be submitting their data to the FDA imminently. The data are impressive. There was a 50% diminution. Of importance is that in the placebo group, there were 8 deaths, and in the treatment group, there were no deaths. That's also very important and very good news. We always hesitate to make any timelines. The FDA will look at the data and in their usual very efficient and effective way will examine the data as quickly as they possibly can, and then it will be taken from there, because once a recommendation is made, then we go through the same process of getting the recommendation for its usage through the CDC.
Though the new pill against COVID looks promising, scientists including Peter Hotz of Baylor College and Texas Children's Hospital Center were also clear that the drug did not signal the end of the pandemic, as both vaccine resistance and variations persist.
Once you start to get sick, it could reduce the likelihood that you'll go to the hospital, but it's no guarantee. So there's a lot of attractive features about it, just like there is for Tamiflu for influenza, which is another way to think about this. As I think somebody mentioned once, it was like Tamiflu for COVID. And we know how that works. It does reduce the severity of illness, but doesn't prevent it entirely, but it can potentially keep a lot of people out of the hospital. I believe it's 2 pills a day for 5 days, so obviously a lot easier to administer and a lot easier to administer as an outpatient as well. Certainly having this drug as another tool in our toolbox, but I think we have to be careful about saying that this is going to be a miracle. It's still no substitute for vaccinating the world.
And that's it from all of us here at First at 9. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.